I want to welcome Michael Carroll and Carolyn Guertin to our discussion. Michael is Professor of Law and Director of the Program on Information Justice and Information Property at the American University Washington College of Law. And Carolyn Guertin is Professor of Digital Technologies and Adult Education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology and a faculty member at Transart Institute in Berlin. Welcome, both of you, and particularly welcome Carolyn from the stormy passage from Texas back to Ontario early this morning. So I'm going to be calling upon my colleagues on the panel as well to contribute to this conversation. Tony Samek, who is the Chair of Library and Information Studies, Ali Shiri, who is Graduate Coordinator in the School of Library and Information Studies, and Tammy Oliphant, Professor in the School of Library and Information Studies. And really the issue that I would like you both to address is this issue of oneness or alternativeness. Michael, you talk about the importance of starting to think of one public. And Carolyn, you mention alternative libraries. You cite the closure of libraries in Newfoundland, the bulldozing of the Occupy Wall Street People's Library, and you pay particular attention to Brooklyn's Reanimation Library, and you mention the sad story of the jailing and ultimate suicide of researcher and hacker Aaron Swartz. Is there a degree of fit, or are we talking about two different poles of understanding between Michael's One Public and your idea of alternative libraries, Carolyn? So, Michael, do you want to start us off on One Public and how we got to One Public and if one could actually be an alternative? So, over to you, Michael.
I was focused on is the fact that the internet allows there to be a single audience that is addressed through the technology. Mm-hmm. That librarians who traditionally were collecting for a particular local audience needn't do so. Of course, the internet, One Public doesn't mean that we're all reading the same material or we're all of one mind. Mm-hmm. But it does mean that in terms of what the relevant resources are and who to target, we ought to be looking at the audience as a single collective. I don't see Carolyn's thesis as in tension with that, so more as focusing on who counts as the relevant public. So yes. I'm focusing on bringing us together through the technological interface, and I think Carolyn's suggesting that when we think about the we have to be broad-minded about who the relevant public is for libraries and how libraries serve. That's the way I read our two pieces. Yes.
So how inclusive is that we? Carolyn, where do you come in on this?
Well, I think that libraries and librarians are always sort of balancing on that knife edge between the commons and the enclosures. Where on the one hand, absolutely, we want them to preserve our history and our traditions. And on the other hand, we want everything available all the time to all of us. Mm-hmm. So there's a real tension there, but I don't think they're at odds. I think that we need both. And I particularly like Michael's focus on this notion of local collections. Mm-hmm. And I think in that way, I think we're making the same argument. We just have, limited audiences at one time.
Are your audiences different, though? Michael, you speak of the inclusivity of the public, but I'm wondering if your public is essentially different from Carolyn's public. Carolyn speaks of the library as the alternative library, at any rate, as a mechanism of resistance, rebellion, and possible play, which takes us back to Mario Hebert's comment earlier today about the library as ludic space. And I'm wondering if this alternative library coincides in any way, Michael, with your one space? Or are they, to be honest about it, really different understandings of the library and its users?
I think what I was trying to say is that the libraries have to be of two minds. They have to maintain the sort of connection to a local public with respect to their physical resources. And so, I guess a question for Carolyn is, to what extent is the Occupy Wall Street Library really an alternative institution rather than just a library with a special collection? Is it really, are they really alternative libraries or just libraries with special collections for alternative audiences? And so I think even with the internet, when you have special physical resources that haven't been digitized, that form of local connection to local audience will remain. Mm-hmm. But, when Carolyn's talking about the Pirate Bay or other online locations, then I see them as serving the same, anyone with an internet connection is the audience for that collection. Mm-hmm. And so that's the one public that I was focused on. Once you're online, you're part of the same public. And the artificial barriers that copyright law and copyright licensing are creating toward creating access to digital resources is the focus of the problem that I wanted to be the main point of my paper.
But is your sense then of the alternative library, Carolyn, something that does away with the issue of the library or the librarian as a use police? Does it make the library, or at least the collection, universally available without restriction? Is that part of the alternative library ethos that you're speaking of, and is really quite different from what Michael is addressing with copyright?
Well, I think they're always ideological, and so in that way, you can never step outside of that ideology. But the alternative libraries I was talking about, they do have a different purpose mm-hmm. than an institutional library. They tend to be short-term or ephemeral, or they have a particular use in mind, like with the Reanimation Library, mm-hmm. where these are creative materials to work with and to repurpose mm-hmm. in ways that the authors and the publishers never intended. Mm-hmm. And so I think they work together. I think you need both. You need the institutional library, but the alternative library serves a different kind of function. It's more political, and it isn't invested in the long term in the same way that the traditional library is. So, but you can work with them together because they do have these different purpose and focus.
Right. I'm thinking in light of the conversations that we've already had today, but I'm thinking of the kind of historical trajectory of the library as an institution. And mm-hmm. you mention in your paper, Carolyn, the work of Melville Dewey, the beginning of traveling libraries in Britain, and I could cite actually Jonathan Vance's History of Canadian Culture, where he draws our attention to garrison libraries in Halifax and the work of Egerton Ryerson in the 1850s in Western Canada, creating the first Library Act, in which libraries were really considered as antidotes to the saloon. Well, I'm wondering if today we have graduated, because I am tracing some kind of trajectory here, I wonder if we've graduated to a more inclusive understanding of the library, where the institution that Michael is speaking of and the alternative that you're addressing, Carolyn, need to coexist. Do you think that's likely, or do you think that's feasible as an assessment of the situation, or is it really quite different? Michael, I'm going to start with you. Does the institutional and the the institutional one public that is inclusive and the alternative library as coexisting. Is this a symptom of where we are in our understanding of libraries today and library access?
Sure, absolutely. And I think the alternative library, I guess I'm pushing back a little on the idea that the alternative library is a completely different institution. Although I take your point, Carolyn, about the ephemeral. Certainly they're not acting as an institution of memory if their view is to be part of the moment, but understanding the moment will end. I tend to think that coexistence is, sure, it's a big world. There's plenty of opportunities. And institutional libraries are in flux. They're looking for new justifications for their roles, particularly in the traditional sort of collection and cataloging functions that have now been overtaken by others through digital technology. And so in some ways, we may see more of a merger as institutional librarians become more flexible in their definition of their role in society.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, Carolyn, that if institutional and alternative libraries can coexist, could they actually share space, or are they architecturally as well as ideologically different?
I think there's good reasons for them not to share space. And that to my mind, it would be better if they did not. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing so many mergings of spaces in digital, the digital realm now, that there's bound to be some overlap. I would hope for conversations between more than for cohabitation. Mm-hmm.
Conversations rather...
Because I think...
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I think they have a lot to say to each other. And Michael talks about this incomplete transition to digital networks that the libraries mm-hmm. are undergoing. And I think that there's also value in the slow transition of libraries, that they not jump on the bandwagon for every new phase, mm-hmm. But also that they make space for new movements like the Creative Commons and for rethinking copyright over the long term.
Mm-hmm. I know you're very invested in Creative Commons and open access, Michael, and you have spoken eloquently when we were together on another panel about it. But when you mention in your paper the need to cobble together library budgets to pay for large licensing schemes, do you see the biggest problem there, or the bigger problem there, since I'm citing two, to be financing or ideology? What most impedes the creation of a larger licensing network, in your view, Michael?
I think, yeah, whether it's ideology or we think about it as our conception, right? That our starting point is that we accept differential access because that's what we've always had. Uh-huh. And I guess I'm asking us to flip the presumption, and the question should be why someone should have to justify differential access based on means, given that we now have technology that allows for universal access. Mm-hmm. And that is a shift in conception or ideology, and that has to happen first. That's why you can't create the political conditions and the institutional conditions to get the kinds of cooperation I hope we can get to mm-hmm. until there's a shared purpose and a shared understanding that the status quo is problematic. So mm-hmm. I think we have to problematize the status quo mm-hmm. much more before we can see real positive movement.
And is it your sense that there is sufficient resistance to this move toward larger networks and that's one of the greater impediments to making them happen. And I guess, Carolyn, you would be interested in this issue of resistance as well, because that seems to underpin the existence of the alternative library. Is the alternative library actually prompting the development of the kind of larger network of One Public that Michael is advocating? I'll start with you, Carolyn. Do you think the alternative library is helping Michael's plan? Let me just call it Michael's plan.
Well, I think that the alternative library is nimble, and it can ask questions that the traditional library cannot about publics because of that. It can also explore issues like the criminalization of creative practice that's happening with these broad sweeping changes in copyright law. I'm not too optimistic about the traditional library being able to meet those issues, because it speaks to so many owners and agendas and shareholders and funders. I can't really answer that, but I would be hopeful.
Well, Michael, I wonder if you're more optimistic, because you cite the Hathi Trust coordinated by Google, and although it's still limited, you did cite it as an example of forward thinking. So overall, are you more optimistic than Carolyn about the future?
In general, yes. I'm disposed to be that way, and I do think...
I'm not trying to paint you as optimist and pessimist, by the way, so please, go ahead.
But I think that basically the pressure, as people come to expect access, either the institutions are going to respond or people will work around it. I think we have a really nice natural experiment that sits in the middle of Carolyn and my papers. Is everyone aware about Sci-Hub? That sort of the large, most of the scientific literature now is available for free on the internet illegally, but it's there, and we can now say, well, who's interested in that? Who is the audience that is serving that was not being served by the model we have today? And that data shows it's a broad range of people who have unmet demands based on the current licensing arrangements we have around the scientific and scholarly literature. And so I take that action to be the kind of protest movement that Carolyn is praising, and I think we can see that the audience that protest has drawn is the One Public that I'm suggesting. They come from all different parts of the world, all different levels of professions. Many of them already have paid access, but the freedom to use and browse this site is better than having to go through the password-protected site at their institutional library. So I think there's a lot to be learned from this event, and it should be studied from both of these perspectives.
As a lawyer, how do you feel about the illegality of Sci-Hub?
Yeah, I have to say I'm conflicted. It is copyright infringement. Those resources were produced under an economic arrangement that relied on a set of legal understandings about control over information. This is why I'm a big proponent of open access publishing. I don't think that we have to have the tension between control and access going forward. There is a new way to publish that aligns the interests of the author and the audience with open access. But to suddenly upend the traditional understandings that copyright law was supporting, I can't agree that that's okay. It's too sudden a shift. It's not fair to the people who are invested in the old understandings.
I hear your conflictedness, I really do. Carolyn, I wonder if you have a comment about Sci-Hub or about the prospects for One Public coexisting with the alternative libraries.
Well, as far as Sci-Hub issues go, I mean, I did write a book on this topic,
Yes.
so called Digital Prohibition, which
yes.
looked at a lot of these issues exactly, and where copyright was originally designed to protect publishers, not authors. It did protect authors initially, but now I think the copyright law has become so perverted that it's only protecting the large corporations, and it's freezing out private citizens. So in that way, things like Sci-Hub are essential if we're going to continue to have access to information. And especially as the university moves and libraries move more and more towards casual labor, access becomes something that's tied to your contract hours and whether you get access or not. So it's, you can have the keys to the kingdom, but only from 10 to noon on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Under the new employment systems and the way that employment is being rewritten within information institutions. So that's where spaces like Creative Commons, like Sci-Hub, like Pirate Bay become really essential. Yes. And the work of people, of course, like Aaron Shorts as well, who fought so hard to make that information public, especially since a lot of the stuff that he was accessing behind firewalls was no longer under copyright.
Michael, is it your sense that copyright legislation, either in the U.S. or in Canada, but perhaps primarily in your case in the U.S., has this legislation been sufficiently nimble or agile or flexible to respond to current situations? What's your view of copyright legislation today?
I am not that optimistic about copyright legislation as such. Although I think there have been positive developments in both our countries from the courts in expanding the user rights through the flexible interpretation of fair dealing in Canada, and with the HathiTrust and the Google Books decision, a reaffirmation of the fundamental nature of fair use as part of the copyright balance. I think. Unlike Carolyn, I don't blame copyright law as such for the source of a lot of our problems. I think it's the way we're using copyright, and that's what the sort of open access, open licensing is a different way to align the relationship between authors and readers that a license implies. And I don't want to wait for copyright reform to be the way we're going to make progress in changing the terms of access, especially to the knowledge-based resources like research and educational materials.
You think that we ourselves within institutions need to be much more alert and active in making those changes?
Exactly. Copyright is just the starting point. Then the question is, what do you do with it? And selling the rights to a publisher that will use those rights against your own community or against the interest of your own community seems like a problem that, we've got to get our own house in order on that one.
Yes. And where would you come in on that issue, Carolyn? Do you agree with Michael that we ourselves have to be more actively engaged in creating copyright conditions that advantage us?
Absolutely, and that's where I think activism comes to play. That we need to be aware of what's controlling us, where our choices lie, what we can do to protect our own material and ourselves as we work in these spaces, and building our own archives wherever we go, and working within open or more open structures to try and keep all kinds of material accessible.
Right. And in flexible containers, I think that term is used as well. I know that my colleagues on the panel, the organizing committee, would be interested in contributing to this conversation, so I'll turn to Toni Samek, who is the chair of our School of Library and Information Studies.
Thank you both for your papers, videos, this discussion. Carolyn, in talking about alternative libraries, and I mean, there's a deep and long history, which I've written about, in the field of librarianship, where we can identify alternative librarianship, progressive librarianship, socially responsible librarianship, independent librarianship, free librarianship, anarchist librarianship. And we can identify this globally. We can look at, for example, Shiraz Durrani's book on progressive librarianship in Kenya. And we see things like radical reference, which has popped up in the U.S. It's not even new anymore. But that involves looking at labor. And all of these movements within the history of our field have, I don't think enough attention has ever been brought on the notion of risk. So, bringing Aaron Schwartz in is interesting and important. But the labor context within a field like librarianship, in Canada, for example, we don't have anything on workplace speech, whereas the American Library Association has a 2005 resolution on workplace speech. Even then, that we know that the American Library Association has no enforcement authority over any library administration in that country. The August 2012 new Code of Ethics for Librarians and Other Information Workers that came out of the International Federation for Library Associations and Institutions has a very lovely suggestion that workplace speech should be valued and encouraged, and yet at the preamble to that document, IFLA acknowledges that it has no enforcement authority over any library administration of any members of IFLA. So we have this curious labor context, so I'll just say in Canada, where we push and advocate the core principle of intellectual freedom, work within the framework of the law. That doesn't prevent us from participating in law reform, such as on copyright. Yet, in our labor contracts, it is very rare to find anything akin to workplace speech, although Saskatoon Public Library actually does have a clause for workplace speech for its employees. We are a deregulated field, we don't lose our MLIS title no matter what we do. We may not advance in our field, but we don't lose it in the way a doctor or a lawyer would. And we know that there's a real precarious labor context. So, I don't think students are exposed to the history of progressive movements in the field globally, that it has a long and deep history. Not enough attention is focused on the risk that people have taken. Things are presented as new trends when, in fact, people don't know who the pioneers are that lay themselves on the line, went out on a limb, even cases we've seen in the States. Of librarians that went out on a limb for intellectual freedom were not defended by their own profession. And then we need to think about this in relation to Aaron Schwartz. So could you maybe just speak to that, like this relationship between, there is a history of an alternative library movement. It's sort of presented as new, and our field in the labor context doesn't encourage risk necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we can look at the history of the counterculture as exactly that kind of expression. And I was particularly taken in my research by the fact with the traveling libraries that the librarians were elected. And what they really did was marketing. They were to sell the library at the same time as they protected it. So I think that activism and librarianship have a lot in common, and I think that to be a librarian is to stand by your principles in the same way that activists do. And every librarian that makes a collection or builds an archive is always taking that kind of risk. And they are the keepers of our memory in a lot of ways. We know as time changes, our memories can be interpreted in all sorts of different ways by all sorts of different people. But if the material hasn't been preserved and curated or cataloged or remarked upon or written about, then we have no memory. And we can't take those, and we can't take any stand, let alone a risky stand. So they're fighting the same battle on the front lines, I think. And I mean, it would be far preferable, of course, if librarians had the same kind of protections for academic freedom and speech that is usually held for professors and other people that are doing other kinds of research projects.
Is it your sense, Michael, that there's been a tradition of activism as well within the legal domain of intellectual property?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think a lot of the activism has come on the right holder's side, but there has been a it's taken a while, but certainly among academics, we'll be coming up on the 25th anniversary of a major issue involving copyright in software, where Pam Samuelson at Berkeley really sort of became much more active in participating in both legislative and judicial proceedings to represent the public interest. And we didn't have EFF and some of these other organizations that made copyright and intellectual property a public interest issue as such. That's a relatively recent development. Librarians, to their credit, have long been the standard bearers of the public interest in copyright discussions, but have often been in a conflicted position when offered special deals, essentially, special carve-outs for the library as an institution, rather than a broader exception or limitation for the general public. And so I think we need librarians to be backstopped by these other public interest organizations. And can I just offer this is a way to think about risk, to offer in your telling about the risk takers. I worry about, when I talk to librarians about risk, I offer this as a way to think about risk when they're worried about providing access where they're not sure about the rights clearance. But risk is a two-sided story. The librarian who wants to control access is afraid of the downside risk of crossing the copyright line. But the other risk is what I call the mission risk, the failure to carry out the mission of the library by providing access because of an overly conservative view about what is and is not permissible. So you're actually balancing against two different kinds of risks. The risk is not all on the side of providing access.
And sometimes the risk is this self-imposed restriction, isn't it? Yes.
Exactly.
I do want to thank Carolyn and Michael for joining us. Thank you very much for your discussion today and your illuminating papers. Thank you again.